Welcome to Creative Connections, connecting the creative, creatively connecting everything else. Today we're talking about hedgerows. We've spent a lot of time walking in the Sussex countryside over the last few years, and I realised the other day that I don't think I've ever really looked at a hedgerow. It's just there.
I think that's true for most of us. We notice the views, the fields, the woods or the hills, but the hedgerows are almost like the background scenery. They're so familiar that we hardly give them a second thought.
And yet they're everywhere.
They really are. They line country lanes, divide fields, edge footpaths and bridleways, and quietly shape the landscape. They're so familiar that it's easy to forget somebody planted them, managed them and relied on them for centuries.
So what actually is a hedgerow?
At its simplest, it's a boundary made up of shrubs and small trees, but that's only part of the story. A hedgerow usually includes the grassy verge beside it, sometimes a bank, sometimes a ditch, and all the wildlife that depends on it. It's really a long, narrow strip of habitat stretching across the countryside.
So it's much more than just a line of bushes.
Exactly, and once you start looking closely, you realise every few metres something different is happening.
Why were hedgerows planted in the first place?
Mainly to mark boundaries and contain livestock. Before modern fencing, a thick hedge was an effective barrier. It marked where one piece of land ended and another began, and if it was properly managed, it also kept animals where they were supposed to be.
Are most of today's hedgerows quite old?
Many are. Some date back several hundred years, and a few follow boundaries that may be older still. Some of the hedgerows we passed on our previous walk up to Chanctonbury Ring may have marked the edges of fields or tracks for centuries.
It's funny you mention that because we're standing beside Long Furlong. I've often wondered where that name comes from.
It's actually an old farming term. A furlong was originally the length of a furrow that a team of oxen could plough before turning round. So Long Furlong literally means the long furrow. It's one of those place names that's quietly preserved the agricultural history of this area.
So even the road name reflects the farming landscape.
Exactly. The road, the fields and the hedgerows all tell the same story. They've evolved over time, but together they remind us that this has been a working landscape for centuries.
That's remarkable because they don't necessarily look old.
No, because they're living things. They keep growing, they're trimmed, they regenerate, and individual shrubs die and are replaced. So although the plants themselves change over time, the boundary itself can remain in the same place for hundreds of years.
Looking at the hedges around here, they all seem fairly similar, are they?
Not really. If you look more closely, you begin to notice quite a mixture of plants. Hawthorn is probably the one most closely associated with a traditional British hedgerow. It grows densely, has sharp thorns and responds well to being cut, which made it particularly useful for creating field boundaries and keeping livestock in. In May, it's covered in clusters of small white flowers. The blossom is so closely associated with that time of year that hawthorn is also known as the May tree, and its flowers are often called May blossom. By autumn, those flowers have developed into small red fruits called haws. They're edible, although they contain a large stone and are not generally eaten straight from the tree. They are much more important as a source of food for birds, particularly as the weather becomes colder. There's also an old saying, lots of haws, lots of snow. The idea was that a heavy crop of hawthorn berries meant a hard winter was on the way. Whether or not that's true, I rather like these old sayings because they're part of how people understood and remembered the natural world.
Blackthorn also has white blossom, doesn't it? How can you tell it apart from hawthorn?
Blackthorn usually flowers earlier in the spring, and its flowers often appear before the leaves. Hawthorn generally flowers later, once its leaves are already out. Blackthorn also has longer, sharper thorns, and later in the year it produces small, dark blue fruits called sloes.
They look rather like blueberries. Can you eat them?
You can, but you probably wouldn't want to eat one straight from the bush. Sloes are extremely sharp and astringent, so they leave your mouth feeling very dry. They're usually used for things such as sloe gin, jelly or jam, where sugar helps to balance that sharp flavour. Traditionally, People waited until after the first frost to pick them because the frost was thought to soften the fruit slightly. These days, many people simply put them in the freezer first. Then there's bramble, which grows through many hedgerows. We often just call these blackberries, but bramble is the plant and blackberries are its fruit. Its long, arching stems can root where they touch the ground, allowing it to spread through gaps in the hedge. Its flowers provide nectar for insects, and by late summer, the blackberries are an important source of food for birds, small mammals, and of course, us. I also remember being told by my Irish mother that you shouldn't pick blackberries after Michaelmas on the 29th of September because the devil had spat on them. It's an old piece of folklore, although there's a practical explanation too. By then, many of the berries are becoming overripe, watery, or affected by insects and mould.
It's interesting how many traditions and bits of folklore are connected with hedgerows.
Yes, it is. They're part of our countryside heritage and remind us how closely people once observed the natural world. Even some of the names we still use have been passed down for centuries. One example is cuckoo spit, the blobs of white froth you may notice clinging to stems and leaves. Despite the name, it has nothing to do with cuckoos.
I've often seen that on plants and in hedgerows in the summer, but I never knew what caused it.
It's produced by the young, or nymph, of an insect called a froghopper. The tiny green insect feeds on the plant's sap and surrounds itself with bubbles made from the fluid, which help to protect it from drying out and from predators. If you look carefully inside the froth, you can sometimes see the insect itself. The adult is called a froghopper because it can jump remarkably well and, with a little imagination, its shape looks slightly like a frog.
It's amazing how much is going on in a hedge that most of us hardly ever notice.
It really is, and we've only mentioned a few examples so far. Elder is also commonly found in hedgerows. If allowed to grow beyond hedge height, it can develop into a small tree. In early summer, it has broad, flat clusters of small cream-coloured flowers, which are commonly used to make elderflower cordial. Later, those flowers become clusters of dark purple-black elderberries, which provide food for birds. Hazel is another familiar hedgerow species. If allowed to grow above hedge height, it produces long yellow catkins, which are among the earliest signs of spring and appear well before the leaves. Later in the year, it produces hazelnuts, although squirrels and other wildlife often find them before we do. Sweet chestnut can also be found growing through a hedgerow. If left uncut, it can develop into a large tree and rise well above the hedge. In summer, it produces long, pale catkins, which gradually fade as the fruits begin to form. The developing chestnuts are enclosed in distinctive green, densely spined cases, which turn brown and split open when the nuts ripen in autumn. Dog rose is another plant you'll often find scrambling through a hedge. It has delicate pink or white flowers in early summer, followed in autumn by bright red fruits known as rose hips. The hips provide food for birds and were traditionally used to make rose hip syrup because they're rich in vitamin C. A hedge may also contain holly, field maple, or young trees such as oak and ash growing through it. These trees, along with elder, hazel and sweet chestnut, can be kept at hedge height by regular cutting, but if left to grow naturally, they can rise well above the hedge.
I have to admit, before today I probably wouldn't have recognised half of those.
I suspect that's true for most of us. We often recognise the hedge as a whole, but not the individual plants growing in it. If you're curious, there are some excellent apps now that can identify wildlife from a photograph. One I use is called Seek, which can help identify plants, fungi, birds, amphibians, insects, and other species. I've found it a really enjoyable way of getting to know what I come across, whether I'm out walking or simply looking around the garden.
So it's really about noticing what's around you.
Exactly. Once you start recognising a few plants, you begin to see the hedgerow rather differently. It's no longer just a green boundary. It's lots of different species, each changing through the seasons and supporting different kinds of wildlife.
So a hedge is lots of different plants growing together.
Exactly. That variety is one of the reasons hedgerows support so much wildlife. Different plants provide food and shelter in different ways, creating a habitat for birds, insects, and small mammals.
At the moment it's the middle of July. Is this a particularly good time of year to notice hedgerows?
It is, although every season has something different to offer. In spring, it's often the blossom and fresh new growth that catch your eye. By the middle of July, the leaves are dense, blackberries are beginning to form, insects are busy among the flowers, and the thick growth gives birds plenty of cover. Then in autumn, the hedgerows are full of berries, providing an important source of food for birds as winter approaches.
That was something I noticed. You hear birds, but you rarely see them.
That's because a hedgerow offers exactly what birds need: shelter from predators, places to nest, somewhere to feed, and somewhere to move about without exposing themselves too much. They'll often disappear into a hedge long before you have a chance to identify them.
So even when a hedge looks quiet, there may be quite a lot going on inside it.
Yes, you might hear a call, see a branch move, or catch sight of a bird for a second before it disappears again. Once you stop and watch for a while, you begin to realize just how much activity is hidden by all that dense growth.
So if we just walked past, we'd probably miss most of it.
I think we usually do. If you stop for half a minute instead of walking straight on, you'll often notice movement, hear different birds calling, see bees working the flowers, or butterflies settling for a moment. The hedge suddenly feels alive.
Is it only birds that benefit?
Not at all. Small mammals use hedgerows to travel through the countryside. Insects feed and breed there. Spiders build webs between the branches. Even reptiles and amphibians can use the cooler, sheltered conditions alongside a hedge. It's a surprisingly rich habitat for such a narrow strip of land.
Especially when it's surrounded by open farmland.
Exactly. People often describe hedgerows as wildlife corridors, and that's a good way of thinking about them. Instead of crossing a large open field, many animals can move along connected hedges where there's food, shelter, and protection.
So they're almost like little roads for wildlife.
That's a good comparison. Just as roads connect villages, hedgerows connect woods, ponds, meadows, and other habitats.
Sometimes you see a hedge that's been cut back really hard. It almost looks as though it's been ruined.
It can look quite severe, but regular management is often what keeps a hedge healthy. If it's left completely alone, it can gradually become a line of trees with very little cover underneath. Trimming helps keep it thick and dense and at a manageable height. A typical managed hedgerow is around 1.5 to 2.5 metres high, or roughly 5 to 8 feet, although there's plenty of variation. Most hedgerows are cut during the winter, once the nesting season has finished. Leaving them untouched through spring and summer gives birds somewhere to nest, while the berries remain available into the autumn.
Is trimming the only way they're managed?
No, there's also a traditional technique called hedge laying. Instead of cutting everything down, many of the stems are partly cut through and bent over while still attached. They stay alive and produce fresh growth, creating a dense hedge again. It's a real skill, and it's still practiced today.
I remember seeing the results of a hedge laying competition a few years ago. It was remarkable how neat and uniform the finished hedges looked.
Yes, hedge laying's a real craft. There are competitions all over the country, with different regions judging slightly different traditional styles. It's as much about skill and craftsmanship, and also a way of restoring an older hedge rather than simply cutting it back. It gives an aging hedge a new lease of life while keeping it as a living boundary.
So some of these hedges have probably been cared for in that way for generations.
Quite possibly. It's one of those traditional countryside skills that's survived because it works.
So there's far more to a hedgerow than you might think at first glance.
Yes, probably because hedgerows serve so many purposes. They form part of the history of the landscape, provide a home for wildlife, mark boundaries that may have existed for centuries, and still perform many of the same practical functions today.
And all this from something most of us barely notice.
Exactly. I think the next time I walk along a country lane, I'll probably slow down and spend a little more time looking into the hedgerows instead of simply walking past them. Once you realise how much life and history they contain, they're no longer just the edge of a field.
And now they seem rather harder to ignore.
Yes, and perhaps that's one of the pleasures of spending time outdoors. You don't always have to find somewhere spectacular. Sometimes you just have to look a little more closely at what's been around you all along. Even something as ordinary as a hedgerow beside a path.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Creative Connections, come back next time and we'll draw a new map of connections. Wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast, please like, subscribe or follow because it helps us keep the channel going and build even more creative connections.